Isabekov and my colleague Artem Muradyan. We work for Swordfish Security. I'm head of static application security testing, and Artem is engineer at Swordfish. So we'll start with saying what fuzzing is about. We will talk about what wrestler is. We will tell you which problems we ran into when fuzzing with wrestler, and we'll talk about the solutions. We'll show you several bugs that wrestler helped us find, and we'll share some best practices in the end.
Что же такое фазинг? Фазинг — это такой метод
So
тестирования,
what is fuzzing? Fuzzing is a method of
в
testing.
том, что мы пытаемся как-то сломать приложение, вызвав его непредвиденное
In
поведение.
fact, we are trying to break the application with providing inappropriate data.
Если про API, то шлем сотни тысяч запросов.
For example, we start up the application hundreds of thousands of times, or through the API we send some inappropriate data and try to
фазерами и сканерами. Фазеры
ищут
баги, которые затем надо докручивать непосредственно
some inappropriate behavior.
до уязвимостей.
Fuzzers and scanners are different things. So scanners look for bugs, while fuzzes look for the opportunities for bugs. Of course, we don't do that manually.
То есть это генерируется вся эта нагрузка
There is a fuzzer, an application that generates this workload automatically. Most fuzzers are random, which makes it possible to find bugs that are not visible in any other way. Fuzzing monitors and analyzes the application to find some memory leaks and stopovers and so on. A good fuzzer identifies all this, logs all this, and makes it possible to analyze. So the terms which we will use during the presentation are the following: interfaces or endpoints. This is how we communicate with our web application. A specification is a file with a description of all interfaces, dependencies, parameters, paths, and so on. And Swagger is, or any other open API, is a good example. Mutators are a function that, for example, accepts a string, changes it, adds something to the string, and brings it back. Mutators. Checkers are programs to identify vulnerabilities in how the messages go back and forth. And grammar is the set of rules how mutators can and cannot change the data. APIs work in web applications and mobile applications. The most popular API is REST API, yes? So security of your API is very important these days. So fuzzing can be actually regarded as a subunit of API security. Burp and analogs can capture HTTP traffic, they can change the parameters, and if you can change parameters, you can fuzz those parameters as well.
Но есть большой минус в том, что они не понимают.
However, the disadvantage is that they don't understand relations between queries, and therefore they cannot create valid strings of messages, which is very important. These are the fuzzers that we liked best. Wrestler Fuzzer from Microsoft is an open source solution which we liked best.
Из особенностей рестлера то, что он проводит анализ спецификации и выявляет зависимости.
Analyzes the specification and identifies dependencies between queries.
То есть он
it actually does stateful RSTP fuzzing. It takes into account the state of the server, the previous queries, and on this basis, it generates new sets of queries. For example, if some sequence has led in a 400 error, the fuzzer will not repeat it. And also this fuzzer understands that before changing some parameters in a resource, you need to create the resource in the first place. For example, it creates a user, and only after that it will try to change the fields in user's profile. And only after that it will change a certain name in subsequent queries. Like any fuzzer, it looks for bugs, like 500 errors of the server, and if the server generates such errors, the fuzzer will log all those errors, and you can look at it afterwards.
То по таблице мы можем видеть, что на самом деле покрываются почти все риски.
You can see that Wrestler really covers almost all risks from top 10 risks on API. Scanners, unlike scanners, Wrestler emulates the behavior of real users better because it takes account of the context. And this is why we can find vulnerabilities that require a set of queries to be analyzed in order to materialize. However, it cannot identify the APIs that can be trusted. We have a paper on haber.com. We actually compared the Wrestler with an open source scanner. Of course, there are several checkers which come out of the box together with Wrestler, but those checkers need to be set up for a specific application.
Загружали в Postman, автоматизировали какие-либо свои задачи.
So Swagger was used to automate tasks, and if you want to use your fuzzer to send queries hand in hand with the Swagger, you need to compile it. That your query starts with a method, then pathway, and so on. So we split all this into some business rules, and they create our grammar. The usage of grammar is called compilation. After the grammar, we compile the settings of the tool itself, parallel queries, the wait time, and so on. After we get all those files in order, we need to test them in order to understand whether the interfaces have been used in the grammar, whether the grammar has executed, whether the parameters are appropriate, and whether we have still consistency between the queries. For example, we have a producer and consumer. We upload a picture, we need to get the ID, and then we download the picture using the ID. So Wrestler can make sense of these interconnections. Now, let's look into the compile stage. You need to identify all interfaces, all parameters, relations between those interfaces, incoming values that will be sent to a specific handle, and config files. So all that is required for Wrestler to work properly. Now let's look at how grammar looks like. On top, you can see a JSON query.
Логин, пароль, какая-то информация.
So you have login and password and user information. This is how this query would look like
у нас получится грамматика,
in a specification for this particular handle.
Грамматика — это питоновский скрипт, который нужен для того, чтобы
Grammar
отправлять запросы,
looks like a Python script that you want to use in order to send the queries to the server and process the replies.
То есть это строки
There are two primitives, wrestler static, the
то есть это уже те строки, которые как раз и будут меняться.
strings that are not going to be changed, and fuzzable strings. They are going to be fuzzed. And there are several ways of modifying this payload.
Когда мы знаем, как выглядит сама грамматика, можно рассуждать, какие этапы тестирования.
So this is how the grammar looks like.
Проверки разные.
So how can we fuzz and what do we fuzz for?
Ручки, которые у нас есть в грамматике,
We
могут
check whether all handles are workable. So can a wrestler actually get through to a specific application? We can use custom headers, for example, if we have any, or we can set up authentication. And if there are any errors, we can modify the specification manually or the grammar. We can add some custom statuses, for instance, if we understand that certain statuses generate 400 error. We can check the settings of the fuzzer itself. We can, for example, set up specific custom values to set up the fuzzer engine. And if we're not fed up with this in the end of this particular stage, we can really go further to the fuzzing process itself. The biggest problem here is to stop the fuzzer, of course. It can be done in terms of the quantity of queries the tool will generate, or the time within which it can generate as many queries as it can. Now, it's important to define what an error is. All 500 responses out of the box are logged as queries, and all the vulnerabilities will also be logged as errors.
Запускаем сам фазер, и он будет нам показывать какие-то уязвимости и ошибки в ходе тестирования.
And after we have defined all this, we start up the fuzzer.
Это проверка миллион срабатываний.
Теперь поговорим про аутентификацию.
Now, let's look at authentication. Out of the box, wrestler already
как это можно сделать. Первое — это просто указать файл, где будет лежать
ways of authenticating. You can
должно быть таким, чтобы мы успели провести фазинг.
Create a file with a token, but it's not very convenient because there is a lifetime to a token. And you can implement an authentication module. During the fuzzing, this function will be called once every timeout, and a new token will be created and fuzzing will continue. Here, for example, you have one set of authentication data, but you can use several. If you want to test, for example, users with the different roles. And after you have seen the grammar, you may have asked yourself, what if we want to use custom-made payloads? For that, you can set up Wrestler with dictionaries. There are 3 types of dictionaries. Custom payload is the main dictionary. You can describe a false list, for example, or something pretty complicated. Then you can really point a link in the grammar to those custom payloads. Custom headers are quite self-explanatory, and on-the-way parameters. In some cases, you need to generate a value dynamically. For that, we have special generators. So there is again a Python script that describes a certain value, and in the dictionary we put a link to this particular script. And your fuzzable string will mutate according to the grammar, which means that it will be different for every subsequent query. Another interesting feature is annotations. So Wrestler allows you to tell him about any particular relationships if they are not recognizable automatically. So on the left, you describe the pathway, the method, and the parameter that we want to target. You need also to put in the consumer parameter. And Wrestler at first saves in the first query a command, for example. So we have created a command and got an ID in response. Wrestler keeps that in memory. And he reads this command from memory in all subsequent queries. This mechanism makes it possible to avoid addressing the queries that are not there anymore, and therefore will get a 404 responses. Now, a pretty rare thing for fuzzers, it's a checker. With checkers, the wrestler can really get 9 out of 10 top HTTP errors. You can also write your own custom checkers. However, there are several checkers that come with the program. Use auto free is one of the most popular ones. You send a command to delete a resource, and then you send a command, I want this resource. And if you get this resource, then the targeted application has a bug. And the second is IDOR search. Out of the box, it's disabled. You need to set it up. For example, you need to put in which resource you will be checking for IDORs. But if you set it up really well, it works better than scanners. So here there should be some slides about what's under the hood, how Wrestler works, and what are the engines, and so on. But we decided to be not too boring. You can follow this QR to a series of our papers on the Wrestler. You can really be bogged down into this if you feel like it.
В частности, инструмента Wrestler, мы столкнулись с большими проблемами, о которых как раз-таки хотели с вами
поделиться. We at first ran into several issues with Wrestler, and we would like to share those issues and solutions with you.
Инструменту API фазингу, может даже и сканерам.
They actually are common for all IP fuzzers and maybe scanners too. Number one, there is no specification for the targeted application. We can use Postman, Burp, Acto, and Mito-Proxy. I think everybody knows Postman and Burp, popular tools. You can use them to generate a specification out of whole cloth or modify it if it's less than full. Acta is a utility for API security analysis. It works as a scanner, but we have a special plugin that can integrate with Burp, and through a proxy, we can export all the Burp results as a Swagger scheme. But the proxy also analyzes traffic, but they have added a new feature, and it can also be used to generate a specification.
Какие проблемы нас ожидают, если мы будем генерировать спецификацию?
Let's look from the practical standpoint. What are the issues you can run in if you generate a specification?
Параметр fuzz, он является...
In this pathway, for example, fuzz is a modifiable parameter.
Только эту часть, то есть другие
And
переменные мы не трогаем.
other variables just can't be changed. But
неверно определяет
when you compile,
можем видеть в правой части
Wrestler
слайда, что он
misreads the type, and on the right you can see that it was defined as a static string, so there will be no fuzzing, but the program will send the same query a million times. In order to prevent that from happening, we need to follow the API documentation, for example, put that into parentheses, and every time this particular value will mutate.
Да, еще одна частая проблема, которая возникает.
Another frequent problem that a lot of people run into, especially when they're new to fuzzing, is typization problem. For example, we don't have the type of ID parameter, and as a result, the type of the parameter is described as a string.
И это не очень выгодно с точки зрения как раз фазинга.
And it does not make for a very efficient fuzzing. So you add a type, integer in this case, and we get a grammar in which the parameter is rested fuzzable int. It's, of course, a very simple structure. You may have a JSON nested into another JSON, and in a pretty complicated scheme, you may not even understand from which type of parameter your queries are generated. So please keep that in mind. Let's look at an example like this. We have info object, ID1, with two parameters, age and city, nested into it. When you create a specification for such a query, the converter may misread the parameters. You can see how it does that in the right-hand part of the slide. And there are two problems with the compilation. Not all parameters will be defined in the grammar. For example, it has loggings and passwords, but not age. And the most important thing, of course, is that the entire body of the JSON will change. Additional characters will be added, and of course, when the JSON structure will be checked, the check will not pass, and the server will just drop all these queries. So the grammar has not worked. Now, what's the solution to this? It's very simple, open API documentation. We need to clearly state that info is an object and enumerate all the nested parameters. After we publish such specification, the names of parameters are static strings, and their values will be fuzzable, not static. So the type will become correct, and if you have examples, for example, in the specification, those examples will be linked together.
Еще очень часто у нас существуют в приложениях какие-то интерфейсы, которые в ответ на запрос отправляют какие-либо файлы.
Very often, applications have interfaces sending files in response to queries. And when a wrestler decodes such files and other such tools decode such files, they generate errors from time to time. In order to handle this, there is a special function that helps ignoring all decoding errors. It is a very simple function, but other tools just don't have it. input, and you either have to write such a function manually, or it may result in the tool waiting for a single response until forever by sending and resending and resending the same thing, which is not good for fuzzing. Compilation errors are also quite frequent, with regular expressions or strings with a lot of special characters may result in a parser malfunctioning and shutting down.
Все элементарно. Для начала пытаемся экранировать. Если не получается, то удаляем регулярно.
At first, in order to resolve this, you either screen this, or you don't use set expressions. And
у него явно больше проблем почему-то.
In the case of Wrestler, from our experience, JSONs are not a very good format for such complicated things.
В принципе, тестирование приложений, что у нас какие-либо
in fuzzing and in any testing, any custom statuses are a problem. You need to put a clear link on, for example, on the rating that error 400 is very bad, 401 is okay, and we can move on. Wrestler has the functionality of listing error statuses versus non-error statuses, and you can drop and disregard some error statuses.
Заставляет нас ждать некоторое время. К примеру, смена пароля.
Some handles may keep us waiting for some time. For example, change password. You have changed the password, then Wrestler tries to send another query like this, but the status will be status 200 and or 200 repeat later. Wrestler can analyze the received text and make or not make repeated requests on the basis of this analysis. When we found this, we saw it was a great opportunity to cover a lot of vulnerabilities. We don't look at only the status, but we look at the full response that we're getting from the server. Now let's look at some bugs and vulnerabilities we were able to identify.
Сначала создавалось два пользователя, user1 и user2, и затем есть у нас
First you create user1, user2, then there is a query that modifies user information. And we try to put the login in the JSON of the payload and in the URL as a parameter. As a result, we get error 500 from the server and so on. And we need to look why that happened and what it can lead to. Another bug. Wrestler automatically, as it fuzzes, adds and deletes parameters in a query. Again, this is modifying user information.
Поле info с какой-то информацией, и все у нас запрос.
We used to have info field with some information, and everything was okay, but in the next query, Wrestler deleted that field, and again, the application generated a 500 error.
Тоже очень интересная находка. Это было связано с DOS-атаками.
Another interesting finding was related to DDoS attacks. The Wrestler
параметрами, которые изначально были спецификации, и
the first query with the specified parameters, and the wait time is 0.1 seconds.
Ставить очень длинные строки в каждый из параметров.
So after that, Wrestler tried to put very long strings into each parameter, and the response time was going up to 3 seconds. I told you that we can customize the maximum wait time. And in this case, the wait time was less than 3 seconds. After we analyzed this trigger, turned out that the mail server was vulnerable to DDoS attacks. For example, when it receives a specific set expression, it fails to respond to anything else. We have also identified some data leak. We have an interface that allows the team to add a user with the specification of the role. Wrestler sent such a query, got a 200 status, and tried to add another user with the same parameters. It got a 500 status, but also logs of which groups the user is already part of, and what are the roles of this user in those groups, which information would be very useful to phishing attack hackers. So what's the best practice? A large specification should be split on the basis of the API functionality. That is a good idea because it's hard to correct any errors in a large specification. It is much easier to do it in a small specification in order to continue with fuzzing as quick as possible. At first, wrestler will first use all the possible combinations with 2 characters, and then it will move into 3 characters and more. It can also put together several uncoordinated queries. It does not result in bugs, but it creates an additional big number of the possible combinations. The number of possible combinations is absolutely astronomical, and you need to set up a time limitation, of course. Custom statuses are generally a very good idea. If your handles have specific status, well, that is a great idea. It can test you administrative functionality. You can make a specus with admin handles and try to get access to admin handles while masquerading as a simple user. REST API should be monitored during the fuzzing. Wrestler does not know what's happening on your server. It can only guess on the basis of the responses. There may be some internal errors, there may be some memory leaks, and so on. So looking at logs at any time is also a very good idea. One other good practice is to add custom-made mutators. For example, we nailed to Radams. This is a utility that generates incoming values for fuzzers. It has pretty complex algorithms inside. That gave us an opportunity to set up the incoming values for the fuzzing in a better way. Linking is best practice. We have already talked about that. Linking really gives you a number of high-quality chains that are not interrelated. And of course, the same thing improves the effectiveness of fuzzing testing. Continuous API inventory. Very often, such corrections are very, very simple. So we decided to automate as much as we can.
вернее, присутствуют только логин и пароль.
In a specification, we have only a login and a password, and we're trying to create a new user. The server tells us that there are some other parameters that it needs, age and city. In order to automate this process, we decided to use a language model. Let's look at it.
Мы использовали интерфейс, чтобы всем было понятно и можно было воспринимать. К примеру, мы отправляем
So this is the interface and the code.
И прикрепляем нашу
So we route the response from the server, we attach our specification, and we use the system prompt, and we ask our large language model that it is a developer and it needs to do this, this, and this. So this is the new spec with the info, and all the other parameters are already integrated.
Общий процесс внедрения языковой модели выглядит примерно следующим образом.
Parameters are compulsory, some not. So this is the overall scheme of the continuous API inventory. We write up the specification, try it, look at logs, and then we put all this to the large language model.
Позволяет экономить время нашего любимого обсека, и он не будет каждый раз руками заходить, править эту спеку и так далее.
This saves a lot of time for OPSEC, who will stay focused on analyzing the errors rather than in modifying the entire spec all the time. One other thing is it's really difficult to monitor all 500s. For example, here we put a name with special characters instead of the name of the user, and got a 500 error in response.
Ошибочка, так сказать. То есть есть некоторые логи, и можно анализировать, понимать, в чем проблема. В 90% случаев это просто 500, и приходится руками проверять.
In 90% of cases, you get just a 500 status, and you have to look into it manually. We also decided to try to automate this process.
Почему бы не использовать опять
And we decided to, again, use a neural network, a language model.
Сам запрос и ответ, который
So
мы
we
получили.
send a query to our model, and this is the response.
О каких-то логах SQL. И у нас модель предугадала, что, вернее,
So our model
вердикт, даже не вердикт, а предполагает, что у нас есть какая-либо уязвимость.
thinks that we have some kind of a vulnerability, and the model tells us through system prompts.
Безопасник, все такое.
The system prompts told the model, you're a tester, you're a security guy, and so on. More or less works.
В целом, он схож с предыдущим, то есть у нас идет сначала
The
тестирование.
process looks very much like the previous one. We test, we log, we analyze reports.
У нас это все направляется в модель, она анализирует.
All this is fed to the model. The model analyzes it and identifies
500, где хоть что-то есть, а не просто 500, что сервак.
the 500 statuses, and we ask the fuzzer we ask the OPSEC to choose only the important vulnerabilities.
Знаете, разделяет
Wrestler
500 и уязвимости.
Really has two ratings, like 500s and vulnerabilities. And in this way, setting it up, you can create a better rating. Wrestler can be used on the basis of a grammar, but it can also be used to test business logic, because it can create valid chains of queries, and it understands the relationships between those chains. Of course, wrestlers can be switched on in a workload testing environment. let your API suffer from several wrestlers, because again, it creates valid chains of queries. Pin testing can also pin testing can also be used. You give the 500 statuses to your pin tester, and they may analyze how to get access to your system. And you can also use Wrestler for differential regression testing. You can test two different versions of the API and then compare the logs in order to identify the regression.
Да, в конце хотел поблагодарить всю команду Swordfish Security и особенно...
I'd like to thank the entire Swordfish Security team and especially Valentin Mamontov for helping us with these slides.
На Хабре и...
Subscribe to us on Haber, and we have a Telegram channel. There are a lot of interesting materials on fuzzing, and please vote for this presentation if you liked it. Thank you very much.
Так, ребят, я попрошу вас встать туда поближе, туда. Давайте перейдем
к let's get into the center stage. Questions, please.
У нас предусмотрен приз.
We have a prize for the best question in each presentation. Let's start from the center. Please wait for the microphone.
Из какой компании и вопрос.
Please identify yourself and your company affiliation when you ask a question.
Solar компания.
Alexei Fedin, Solar. You told us about grammars and specifications. Well, it's a little bit creepy, but okay. But you showed us the vulnerability as well. Okay? These are bugs that they are very, very simple. Okay?
Баги, то, что у вас были, по идее, это, может найти обычный ручной тестировщик, там не было никакого rocket science. Поэтому
manual tester can find those bugs, no rocket science. So what is the balancing act? When do you use a fuzzer and when do you use manual testing?
Если можно заставить тестировщика это сделать.
Абсолютно верно.
So why do you use this if you can go to a tester and use it?
То есть если бы это все делалось как-то относительно просто, это одно.
If it were simple, it's okay, but you have to set up your grammar first, and that's the same amount of manual work in order to catch pretty simple bugs.
Запрос нужно относительно сложный строить, либо еще что-то подобное.
Я понял, спасибо. Ну, смотрите, на самом деле, да, понятно, что достаточно тяжело настроить. Все зависит от качества вашей спецификации. Чем лучше спецификация, тем меньше вы потратите времени,
the less time you spend on compiling your grammar and start fuzzing, and the rest goes on automatically. Of course, we could not show you the real bugs, and of course, we could not tell you whose bugs they were. We just showed you what Wrestler can do out of API top 10s, and you can't find it in any other way. And on testing, paying money to testers, or you pay money once to set up grammar and then you get all the bugs you want, I think that does make a difference. So I think this is much more comprehensive. Testers and OPSECs have different tasks. It not only finds bugs, but vulnerabilities, and it can be used also to help pin testers and something else. So it's a pretty comprehensive thing. And for example, in our spec, we have 200 handles. So you can ask a tester to compile a lot of different variants, but a fuzzer, Wrestler, can do that automatically. So we don't need a person to check all that manually. So you get a list of all 200 handles, and the rest happens automatically.
То есть у нас тут как раз-таки суть в том, что строятся цепочки. Вот.
So this is why we say that it creates intelligible chains of commands.
Привет, спасибо большое за доклад.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. Daniil of Sigalov, Sovilsoft.
Очень много вопросов задалось.
I have a lot of questions actually, but
самых основных. Первый про
the two biggest questions to me are connections between queries. You can configure it manually, which of the queries will be interconnected, but my understanding is that Wrestler, even without this manual configuration, tries to understand which queries are connected. Well, if you read our paper, we have described all that. But put it roughly, any query has some parameters. If there is a query and it doesn't have the pool of parameters, it just won't go in. So first, you get those parameters. You send only the queries for which you have a full stack of parameters. It's not exactly, a dependency or relationship, but it will not send any dumb queries. It will try to get parameters from the previous queries. So it has a common database of all parameters, and when it forms a new chain and adds a new query, it will see whether the new query has all the parameters, and only if it has, it will be added into the pool. Super quick question. Does Wrestler use server coverage, and does it want to maximize server coverage? No, Wrestler doesn't do that. The only response it gets from the server is status and text. Of course, you can write libraries or scripts on the server side, but coverage, it doesn't understand coverage. So during the testing, you start testing, you identify how many handles you have, and then, of course, you can quantify how many handles have generated the response. But that's not coverage in itself. Do you already have implementation practices for developers? Can you reuse reports at various stages? And can you differentiate between several stages? Right now, we use it for our internal products. We test our own API. We have some third-party applications as well. When you integrate it, I think you need to integrate it in the very beginning of development. When a developer has written a feature, you need to understand how to correctly describe a spec. If the spec is okay, so that was a question on the relationship. If you have a link to a spec, of course, the software will understand that there is a relation to the spec. So I think you need to integrate at the coding stage, and during the testing, of course, it is a classic tool during testing. Hope I've answered this question. Anyone else? Well, let's move to the right.
Привет, меня зовут Роман Корнилов, Уральский центр
Hi, I'm Roman Kornilov, Urals Center for Systems of Security. When you talked about analyzing results, you have used language models. Was it your in-house writing, or you've used something else? Well, we first used GPT, but we didn't want to spill our logic. Then we deployed Llama, a simple version, and we used it. It can't generate POCs or it can't verify the vulnerability, but it is good enough to get a log and say, hey, I think there is a vulnerability there. There are some language models that are specially trained to do this, but so far we have not studied it. If you have any combat experience on this, well, so far we don't have this, or we're still at the development stage. But do you need to train your model additionally to get a queries in the context of vulnerabilities? Can you repeat this? But you said that you were using yes, you've deployed an existing model. Have you trained it additionally? No, it's just a usual model. Number 3, number 4, Llama, of course, was pretty convenient, but, so we didn't train it any additional. Okay, there is another question in the first row.
Спасибо за доклад, очень интересно.
Thanks for the presentation. I also have a question on implementation. So I'm new to fuzzing. Do I need to start with Wrestler or with some simpler tools to kind of get into the spirit of the thing? And if we were able to set up everything and find bugs in a big fat service, can you quantify how long it will take to introduce this in 10,000 other services? Well, start with the latter. Of course, some extrapolation is possible, and the better your specification is, the fewer problems you would have in the implementation stage. And I will take the first question. Schematizes. It works a little differently. You can save the parameters, but it does not create chains of queries, and it does not have any analysis tool. So they have created a chain, and that's it. Wrestler is different, and I would recommend to start with Wrestler, because it doesn't make sense to start with something simpler. Of course, depending on the development of your spec. Okay, but can you quantify the labor intensity? Well, that was your second question. It's the most difficult thing to start. We need to understand how Wrestler compiles. And it takes you some time it takes you an hour to describe a handle. But right now, our people manually can describe 8, 9 handles or services in 1 hour. Well, handles, yes. And we have not yet tested multi-service environments, so we do not have information on services.
Не забываем только представляться, ребят.
Добрый день. Please identify yourself. Сергей Девятов, Самокат Тех.
На самом деле сидел так, думал, куда это можно перетянуть. Отсюда 2 вопроса. Первое, что
where to use it.
Грубо говоря, то есть, что для вас критерии остановки?
What is your stop criteria?
Глубина этого
So you're fuzzing and fuzzing and fuzzing. Is it some kind of a threshold or a depth of the threshold and so on? And secondly, did you think of UL graph? Because it has some changes and chains, and it will make life much simpler for your testers, because the relationships, what you're appraising, are very important there.
Критериям остановки, на самом деле есть множество, но мы говорили о том, что нужно...
Well, there are a lot of criteria to stop.
По времени можно остановиться.
We told you that you can set the timeout.
Но Wrestler останавливается.
You can put the timeout for a week and so on.
То есть вот он, не знаю,
but I think the maximum length of chain that works best with Wrestler.
Все возможные комбинации цепочек запросов длины, которые вы указали, он не остановится, он будет молотить, укажете.
So Wrestler will work until it gets to the length of chain that's larger than your specification. For example, 100 will mean that it works forever. On GraphQL, Wrestler does not support it. Maybe it's part of the roadmap, but I don't know. Schemathesis supports GraphQL, but there are fewer features. If we need it, we will move toward GraphQL.
Тоже примерно похожий. Ну, спасибо, классная идея.
Yeah, great idea anyway.
Давайте, наверное, выберем лучший вопрос.
Okay, let's choose the best question.
Там был про модели, про до какой степени нужно перед тем, как остановиться, да?
Наверное, дайте последний, потому что, в принципе...
Okay, last question, I think.
Очень интересный вопрос. Мы тоже смотрим в сторону изучения GraphQL.
Because that's an interesting question where we're looking toward GraphQL. So I think that was interesting to me.